Welcome to your new home for horror stories and rainy nights. Whether you followed me from the old channel or you're just discovering these dark tales, prepare yourself for an enhanced experience. Same bone-chilling stories, same calming rain, but with better audio quality that will make every whisper and every raindrop feel real. Hit subscribe and the notification bell. Our journey into the darkness is just beginning, and trust me, you don't want to be alone when the next story drops. Sweet nightmares, everyone. Let the rain and terror begin. I'm 26 now and living in Pennsylvania, but my childhood was spent in the dense, verdant forests of Montpelier, Vermont. Those formative years shaped me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. Vermont isn't just a place on a map to me, it's where I learned how deceptive beauty can be. Growing up, I spent countless hours hiking mountain trails, swimming in pristine lakes, and exploring the expansive forests that blanketed the state like a thick, green quilt. I knew Vermont had its hazards: black bears that occasionally wandered too close to residential areas, timber rattlesnakes in the more secluded regions. But I never imagined anything truly sinister lurked in those woods. My parents raised me to respect nature but never fear it. "The forest gives us everything," my father would say. "Clean air, wood for our fires, peace for our minds." He was right about most things, but not about this. Some places in those woods don't want to give. They only want to take. When I moved to Pennsylvania for work after college, I felt a strange relief washing over me. I couldn't explain it then, but part of me knew I needed distance from Vermont. The incident at Moss Glen Falls had damaged something inside me, left a wound that wouldn't quite heal. Looking back at photographs from my childhood, I noticed something now that escaped me then. A tension in my shoulders when outdoors, a vigilance in my eyes that shouldn't be present in a child so young, as if some primal part of me always knew something was watching from the tree line, waiting. What happened on that summer day in 2021 confirmed what that childish instinct had been trying to tell me for years. There are things in this world that cannot be explained, things that prey on our certainty that we understand the natural order. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I experienced, but some memories refuse to be sanitized by logic. I'm sharing this now, not to frighten you, but as a warning. Some wilderness paths should remain untraveled. Some experiences should remain unshared. But I can no longer bear the weight of this alone. So I write these words and hope you believe me. Or at the very least, consider that there might be more to those quiet woods than you've been led to believe. When I was 19, I was like most college students, perpetually exhausted, surviving on coffee, and desperate for escape from the crushing pressure of academics. Jasmine and I met in our Introduction to Psychology course at the University of Vermont. She was from Connecticut, a self-proclaimed city girl who had never truly experienced the wild heart of Vermont. One Wednesday in late July, after a grueling morning of summer classes and research papers, Jasmine dropped into the seat beside me in the campus coffee shop, her eyes bright with that particular gleam that always meant trouble. "I can't stand another minute in that stuffy library," she declared, pushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "We need to get out of here, now." I looked up from my textbook, bleary-eyed and skeptical. "And go where exactly?" "Anywhere. Somewhere with water, somewhere quiet. You're the local. Take me somewhere amazing." That was Jasmine. Impulsive, demanding, infectious in her enthusiasm. The idea took root immediately. We could both use a break, and I knew just the place. "How about Moss Glen Falls?" I suggested. "It's about an hour drive from here. Beautiful waterfall, swimming holes, hiking trails. Not many tourists on weekdays." The excitement in her eyes was all the answer I needed. We agreed to leave early the next morning, packing lunch, towels, and enough sunscreen to survive the July heat. What I didn't pack was caution. What I didn't bring was fear. Those would come later, unbidden and unwanted. That night, I dreamt of dark water rushing over stone, of shadows moving against the current. I woke sweating despite the air conditioning. A nameless dread settled in my chest. I dismissed it as pre-trip anxiety and went about preparing for our day out. The morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect summer day that Vermont specializes in. Blue skies, gentle breeze, temperature hovering around 75 degrees. We loaded my old Honda Civic with supplies, spirits high as we navigated the winding country roads towards Stowe. I've never really seen much of Vermont beyond campus, Jasmine admitted as we drove, her finger tracing patterns on the condensation of her water bottle. It's so green and empty. I laughed, gesturing to the rolling landscape outside our windows. That's the whole appeal. 4,000 people in Stowe, and most of them mind their own business. Wait until you see the falls. It's like stepping into another world. How ironic those words seem now. We were indeed stepping into another world, one where the rules I had trusted my entire life would be broken in ways I'm still struggling to comprehend. As we approached Stowe, I pointed out landmarks, shared local legends, played tour guide to hide my growing unease. Something felt off, but I chalked it up to returning to these mountains after months away at school. I didn't realize then that sometimes our instincts recognize danger long before our conscious mind can name it. Moss Glen Falls is one of those places that seems designed to make you believe in perfect things. The main waterfall cascades approximately 125 feet down a series of moss-covered rock formations, creating numerous pools and smaller falls along the way. The surrounding forest crowds close to the water, creating a natural amphitheater that amplifies the constant rush of water against stone. When we arrived around noon, the parking area held only 2 other vehicles: a weathered pickup truck and a sensible sedan that presumably belonged to the elderly couple we would briefly encounter. The trail to the falls was well maintained but felt wonderfully remote, the canopy overhead filtering sunlight into dappled patterns across our path. "This is incredible," Jasmine whispered as the falls came into view, her voice almost reverent. "How is there nobody else here?" "Weekday magic," I replied, setting down our cooler on a large, flat boulder beside the lowest pool. "Most tourists hit the more accessible spots. This takes a bit more effort to reach." The elderly couple nodded politely as they passed us on their way out, the woman pausing briefly to advise us about slippery rocks near the upper pools. Within minutes, we had the entire natural wonder to ourselves. We spread our towels on sun-warmed stones, unpacked our lunch, and alternated between eating and dipping into the crystal-clear water. The lower pool was deep enough for proper swimming, though bracingly cold even in July. Higher up, smaller pools formed perfect natural hot tubs, warmed by hours of direct sunlight. After lunch, we climbed carefully alongside the falls, using established handholds in the rock face to reach the upper pools. From there, the view was spectacular. Rolling Vermont mountains stretching to the horizon, trees swaying gently in the summer breeze. The valley below us vibrant with life. "I could stay here forever." Jasmine sighed, floating on her back in one of the upper pools, eyes closed against the sun. "This beats Connecticut any day of the week." I smiled, trailing my fingers through the cool water. Vermont has its perks. We spent hours like that, swimming, sunbathing, taking photographs, and simply absorbing the perfect tranquility of the place. In retrospect, I realize now that the serenity was part of what made what followed so devastating. The contrast between peace and terror was almost artful in its cruelty. As the afternoon progressed, shadows lengthened across the pools. The air cooled slightly, and the forest around us grew more vocal. Birds calling, insects humming, leaves rustling in the strengthening breeze. Normal sounds, natural sounds, or so they seemed. "We should explore some of the trails before we lose the light," Jasmine suggested, wringing water from her hair. "I want to see more than just the falls." I hesitated, glancing at my watch. It was just past 4. Plenty of daylight remained, but something in me whispered caution. I ignored it, as we so often ignore the quiet voice of self-preservation. "There are a few good trails that loop around and bring you back to the parking area," I said, reaching for my t-shirt. "Nothing too strenuous. We could be back before sunset." And so we dressed, packed our wet towels into our bags, and stepped away from the safety of the falls into the waiting forest. The transition felt significant somehow, leaving the open, sunlit space of the waterfall for the close, shadowed paths that wound through the trees. If I'd known what waited for us there, I would have run in the opposite direction. The trail system around Moss Glen Falls isn't particularly complex. A main loop approximately 2 miles long, with smaller offshoot paths that return to the main trail at various points. Under normal circumstances, it would be difficult to become truly lost. But as we would soon discover, these were not normal circumstances. We started on the well-trodden main path, Jasmine stopping frequently to photograph wildflowers or interesting fungi growing on fallen logs. The forest was lush with summer growth, ferns unfurling in the understory, black-eyed Susans nodding in small clearings, the occasional startled movement of a chipmunk or ground squirrel disturbed by our passing. "I can't believe people actually live with this in their backyard," Jasmine said, bending to examine a cluster of brilliant red berries. "Are these edible?" "Absolutely not." I pulled her hand back gently. "Those are baneberries, highly toxic. Vermont forests are beautiful but not always friendly." She straightened, looking slightly abashed. "City girl ignorance. Got it." We continued along the path, the conversation easy between us. I pointed out various plants and trees, sharing what knowledge I had accumulated during my childhood explorations. The summer forest was alive around us, vibrant with the business of growing, hunting, surviving. After about 30 minutes of walking, we reached a fork in the trail. The left path continued the main loop back toward the parking area, wider, obviously well-traveled. The right path was narrower, disappearing around a bend into a denser section of forest. "Which way?" Jasmine asked, looking between the two options. "Left is the main trail back," I explained. "Right is probably one of the smaller loops that eventually reconnects." Jasmine's expression turned mischievous. "Let's take the road less traveled then." I should have insisted on the main path. I should have recognized the way the light seemed to drain from the right-hand trail, how the forest sounds dampened slightly in that direction. But I didn't. And so we turned right, stepping off the security of the main loop into the waiting embrace of the deeper woods. The path immediately narrowed, forcing us to walk single file. The tree canopy thickened overhead, reducing the already waning afternoon light to a dim greenish glow. The air felt different here, heavier, more still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "It's cooler here," Jasmine observed, rubbing her arms. "And quieter." She was right. The bird calls had diminished, the insect chorus muted. Only the soft sound of our footfalls on the dirt path broke the unnatural silence. We continued forward, the path winding through increasingly dense undergrowth. Several times we had to push aside hanging vines or duck under low branches. The trail began to feel less maintained, more wild with each step. After 15 minutes on this path, I began to worry. We should have reconnected with the main loop by now. Instead, the trail kept pressing deeper into unfamiliar territory. "I think we should turn back," I suggested, stopping to orient myself. "This doesn't seem to be looping around like it should." Jasmine paused ahead of me, frowning. "Just a little further? I want to see where it goes." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Just a little further. Those 4 words have preceded countless disasters throughout human history, and ours would be no exception. The path began to climb slightly, leading us up a gentle rise. At the top, it split again, this time into 3 barely distinguishable directions. None of them looked particularly well-traveled. "Okay, This is definitely not right, I admitted, frustration edging my voice. We need to go back. Jasmine nodded, her earlier enthusiasm dimming as she glanced at her phone. No service out here, and it's getting darker. We turned around, intending to retrace our steps to the first fork, but somehow, the path behind us no longer looked familiar. The forest had a way of shifting subtly around us, landmarks changing their appearance with the fading light. That was when I first felt it. The slight prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling of being observed. I turned quickly, scanning the trees behind us, but saw nothing unusual. Just shadows gathering between trunks, darkness pooling in the understory. Do you feel that? I asked quietly. Feel what? Jasmine looked around nervously. Like we're being, I don't know, watched. She shivered visibly. I didn't until you said it. Thanks for that. We picked up our pace, trying to follow our original trail back, but each turn seemed to lead us further from where we thought we should be. The light continued to fade, and with it, our confidence in finding our way. We were lost, though neither of us wanted to admit it. Lost in a forest that suddenly felt much vaster and more menacing than it had just hours before. Time behaves strangely when you're lost. Minutes stretch into what feels like hours. Panic distorts perception. The summer sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees. What had been a pleasant, warm day was transforming into something altogether different. We've been walking for at least 40 minutes, Jasmine said, swatting at a mosquito on her arm. We should have hit the main trail by now. She was right. Our clothes were damp with sweat, our skin increasingly covered in itchy mosquito bites. The bathing suits we wore beneath our clothes had dried uncomfortably against our skin, adding to our discomfort. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, or at least enough battery to use the compass function. One bar flickered tantalizingly before disappearing. The compass spun uselessly, affected by something in the surrounding rocks or soil. Let's try to be logical, I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. The falls are to the east of the parking lot. The sun sets in the west. So if we head toward the setting sun, we should eventually hit the main road. It was basic wilderness survival, something every Vermont child learned. But in that moment, with the forest growing darker and more unfamiliar by the minute, even these simple principles seemed insufficient. We chose a direction and walked, our earlier conversation replaced by tense silence. The forest was changing around us, not just darkening with the approach of evening, but somehow becoming more dense, more watchful. The trees seemed to press closer, branches reaching lower, undergrowth thickening to impede our progress. The first strange sound came about 20 minutes into our new course. A rustling in the undergrowth to our right, too substantial to be a small animal, too deliberate to be the wind. What was that? Jasmine whispered, freezing in place. Probably a deer, I replied automatically, though something in me doubted it. There are lots of them around here. She nodded, but her expression remained unconvinced. We continued walking, both now hyper-aware of the sounds around us. The normal forest noises, bird calls, insect chirps, the rustling of leaves, had taken on a sinister quality in our anxious state. The rustling came again, this time behind us. Jasmine's hand shot out to grip my arm. I definitely heard something following us, she hissed. It's probably curious about us, I reasoned, though my heart rate had accelerated. Wildlife sometimes follows humans out of interest. It won't approach us. Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Deer in Vermont were habituated to human presence. They might observe from a distance but rarely followed. Bears occasionally showed interest but generally avoided human trails. Whatever was paralleling our path was behaving unusually. We quickened our pace, no longer trying to navigate purposefully, just wanting to put distance between ourselves and whatever lurked in the underbrush. The light was fading rapidly now, the forest floor becoming treacherous with hidden roots and rocks. "Wait!" I said suddenly, pointing ahead. "I think I see a clearing." Through the trees, a patch of open space was visible. Not the parking lot, but at least somewhere we might get our bearings. We hurried toward it, pushing through a dense thicket of ferns. The clearing wasn't large, perhaps 30 feet across, but it contained something familiar. A wild blackberry patch I recognized from earlier in our hike. We had passed it shortly after leaving the main trail. "I know where we are," I said, relief flooding through me. "This is near the first fork. The main trail should be that way." I pointed to a barely visible path leading away from the clearing. Jasmine's shoulders slumped with relief. "Thank God. Let's get out of here before it's completely dark." We headed down the indicated path, our spirits lifting slightly at the prospect of finding our way back. The forest seemed less oppressive now, the gathering darkness less threatening. Then Jasmine stopped suddenly, her body tensing. "Did you hear that?" I listened, at first hearing nothing unusual. Then it came, a distinct sound of branches snapping, much closer than before. Not the random noises of the forest, but deliberate movement. Something was following us, and it wasn't being subtle anymore. "It's just a deer," I said again, trying to convince myself as much as her. "They make a lot of noise moving through the underbrush." "That doesn't sound like a deer," Jasmine whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It sounds bigger." I switched on my phone's flashlight, directing the beam toward the sound. The light penetrated only a few feet into the dense foliage before being swallowed by shadows. Nothing visible, yet the sense of a presence remained. "Let's keep moving," I urged, my voice lower than intended. "We're close to the main trail now." We continued forward, no longer attempting to move quietly. Speed was more important than stealth now. The path widened slightly, offering hope that we were indeed approaching the main loop. The snapping sounds continued behind us, sometimes fading, sometimes drawing nearer. Whatever was following us seemed to be pacing us, keeping a consistent distance. The behavior was unnerving, not the random movements of an animal going about its business, but the purposeful tracking of a predator. "I'm scared," Jasmine admitted, her voice small in the growing darkness. "Me too," I confessed. "But we're going to be fine. We just need to keep moving." As if to mock my reassurance, a new sound emerged from the darkness behind us. Not branch snapping or rustling leaves, but something altogether more disturbing. A sound like static, like an old radio tuning between stations, but organic somehow. Almost like a cat's meow, but distorted, wrong. My flesh crawled at the unnatural noise. No animal in these woods made sounds like that. Nothing in my experience of Vermont wildlife prepared me for that noise. What the hell was that? Jasmine's voice had risen in pitch, fear overwhelming her attempt to stay calm. "I don't know," I admitted. "But look, I can see the main trail ahead." Through the trees, a wider path was visible, the ground more firmly packed from frequent foot traffic. The main loop trail, our passage back to safety. We broke into a run, no longer caring about the noise we made, desperate to reach the relative security of the established path. As we emerged onto the main trail, the strange static meow sound came again, louder this time, and accompanied by something new. A low, bubbling sound that might, in a nightmare, be mistaken for laughter. The relief of finding the main trail was short-lived. Though wider and more defined than the paths we'd been wandering, it was still enveloped in near darkness. The forest canopy blocked what little remained of twilight, forcing us to rely on our phone flashlights to navigate. "We should be able to follow this straight back to the parking lot," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. 15 minutes tops." Jasmine nodded, her face ghostly in the harsh electronic light. Her eyes kept darting to the woods on either side of us, searching the darkness for movement. We walked briskly, the beam of light bouncing ahead of us, illuminating the path in jerky segments. The forest pressed close on both sides, branches occasionally scraping against our arms as we passed. The sense of being observed had intensified, no longer a vague feeling but a certainty that made my skin tighten with goosebumps. "It's still following us," Jasmine whispered, not looking back. "I can hear it moving parallel to the trail." She was right. The sounds of movement had shifted from behind us to our left, keeping pace through the underbrush. Occasionally branches would crack or leaves would rustle, betraying its position. Whatever it was large enough to make substantial noise, but agile enough to move through dense forest with relative ease. "Just keep walking," I instructed, my mouth dry with fear. "Don't run unless I say so. Running might trigger a predator response." That was what I had always been taught about encountering wild animals. Don't run, don't show fear, back away slowly. But this didn't feel like any normal wildlife encounter. The calculated way it was keeping pace with us, the unnatural sounds it occasionally emitted. This was behavior beyond my understanding. We continued forward, our pace quickening despite my advice. The darkness between the trees seemed to shift and flow, shadows taking on substance and depth beyond what was natural. My rational mind insisted it was just fear distorting perception, but some deeper instinct screamed otherwise. Then came the cat sound again, that distorted, static-filled approximation of a meow. It was closer now, perhaps only 20 feet away in the woods to our left. Jasmine's hand found mine, squeezing with painful intensity. "What is that?" she breathed. "It doesn't sound right." "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're going to ignore it and keep walking." The sound came again, followed by that bubbling, inhuman laughter. It was a sound no animal should be capable of making, too structured, too deliberate. It raised a primal fear in me, a recognition that whatever made that noise was neither fully animal nor something I could comprehend. My flashlight beam caught a flicker of movement between the trees, something pale moving parallel to us. I jerked the light back, but whatever it was had vanished. "Did you see that?" Jasmine hissed. "Just keep walking," I repeated, my voice tight. "Don't look directly at it." Another lesson from childhood. Don't make eye contact with predators. But was that what we were dealing with? A predator? The word seemed insufficient for the growing dread I felt. The trail curved slightly, and ahead I could make out a familiar silhouette against the night sky, the large boulder that marked the trailhead with its memorial plaque. Beyond it would be the parking lot and my car. Safety was tantalizingly close. "There's the boulder," I said, relief washing through me. "We're almost there." As if triggered by my words, the distorted cat sound came again, louder and more urgent. This time it was directly behind us on the trail. I turned instinctively, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. What it illuminated stopped my breath. A large buck stood on the trail behind us, perhaps 30 feet away. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be alarming. Deer are common in Vermont forests. But several things about this deer were profoundly wrong. Its eyes reflected the flashlight with an unnatural blue-green luminescence, too bright and too steady. Its posture was strange, head held unnaturally high, front legs planted wider than normal. But most disturbing was its absolute stillness. No tail flick, no ear twitch, no shifting of weight. It stood completely motionless, like a taxidermied specimen rather than a living creature. "Don't move," I whispered to Jasmine. "Just back away slowly toward the boulder." We began to retreat, step by careful step, never turning our backs on the deer. It remained frozen, those glowing eyes fixed on us with an intelligence that no deer should possess. We had covered perhaps 10 feet when the impossible happened. The deer's mouth opened. not in the normal browsing motion of a herbivore, but in a deliberate, almost human way. From it came that distorted, static meow sound, followed by the bubbling laughter. Jasmine's grip on my hand became crushing. "That's not possible," she breathed. "Deer don't make sounds like that." "Keep moving," I urged, fighting the urge to run. "Almost to the boulder." The deer took a single step forward, its movement jerky and awkward, as if its joints worked differently than they should. Then another step, and another. It was following us down the trail, still making those impossible sounds. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This violated everything I knew about deer behavior, about natural law. Deer don't stalk humans. They don't laugh. They don't mimic other animals. What we were witnessing simply couldn't exist in the rational world I had always inhabited. We backed up faster, our earlier caution overwhelmed by growing panic. The boulder was now only 20 feet away, the parking lot just beyond. When we reached the boulder, "We run," I whispered. "Don't look back. Just sprint for the car." Jasmine nodded, her face pale with terror. The deer continued its steady advance, still emitting those wrong, broken sounds. Its movements remained stiff and unnatural, as if something was wearing the deer rather than being the deer. 5 more feet to the boulder. The deer quickened its pace. 3 feet. It broke into a shambling trot. Our backs touched the cold stone of the boulder. "Run!" I shouted. We turned and sprinted for the parking lot, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly across the gravel. Behind us came the sound of hooves, much faster now, and that terrible laughter growing louder. The parking lot appeared ahead, empty except for my Honda sitting alone under the single security light. Jasmine reached it first, tugging desperately at the passenger door handle. "The keys!" she screamed. "Give me the keys!" I fumbled in my pocket, hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the key fob. Behind us, the sound of hooves on gravel grew closer. I didn't look back. Some instinct warned that seeing what pursued us might break something essential in my mind. I pressed the unlock button, the car's lights flashing in response. Jasmine yanked the door open and threw herself inside. I circled toward the driver's side, finally risking a glance behind me. The deer had stopped at the edge of the parking lot, standing motionless again in that unnatural posture. Its glowing eyes tracked my movement, its head tilting at an impossible angle. Then it did something no deer should be capable of. It raised itself slightly onto its hind legs, front legs lifting off the ground. "Get in the car!" Jasmine shrieked from inside. "It's coming!" I lunged for the driver's door, wrenching it open. As I did, my hair caught on something. A sharp tug that stopped my forward momentum. Thinking it was a branch, I reached up to free myself, only to feel something solid and cool beneath my fingers. Not a branch, something else. I turned slowly, heart thundering in my chest. The deer was directly behind me, now fully upright on its hind legs. Its antlers were inches from my face, my hair entangled in one of the points. Its breath hit my face, not warm as a mammal's should be, but strangely cold and odorless. Those glowing eyes were level with mine, filled with an intelligence that was neither animal nor human. Up close, other wrongness became apparent. Its fur didn't move naturally in the breeze. Its chest didn't rise and fall with breath. The edges of its form seemed slightly blurred, as if it wasn't fully present in our reality. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. The deer's mouth opened again, that bubbling laughter emerging. This close, I could see its throat didn't move correctly to produce the sound. The noise simply happened, without the physiological processes that should accompany it. Time seemed suspended as we faced each other. Me, a terrified human girl, and this thing that wore the shape of a deer but was fundamentally something else. Something that shouldn't exist in a rational world. The spell broke when the deer leaned closer, its cold breath washing over my face. Primal terror surged through me, overwhelming logical thought. I screamed, a high, piercing sound that seemed to startle the creature. In that moment of its hesitation, I yanked my hair free from its antler, feeling strands tear from my scalp. I threw myself into the car, slamming the door behind me. "Drive!" I screamed at Jasmine, who had already scrambled into the driver's seat and started the engine. She didn't hesitate, flooring the accelerator before I'd even fully settled. The tires spun on gravel before finding purchase, launching us forward toward the access road. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the deer thing, still upright, still watching us with those glowing eyes. Neither of us spoke as Jasmine navigated the winding road down from the falls, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Tears streamed silently down my face, my body shaking uncontrollably with delayed shock. What we had encountered defied explanation, violated the natural order I had trusted my entire life. It wasn't until we reached the main highway, streetlights illuminating the car interior, that Jasmine finally broke the silence. What was that thing? Her voice was barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might somehow summon it. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "I really don't know." She glanced at me, her face still pale with fear. It wasn't a normal deer. The way it stood up, those sounds it made, that wasn't natural. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. Do you think—" She hesitated. "Do you think it was trying to hurt us?" I considered the question, trying to make sense of the encounter. I don't know what it wanted, but it was intelligent, deliberate. It was stalking us through the forest, herding us in a specific direction. Why did it let us go? That question haunted me more than any other. The creature could have attacked at any point during our ordeal. It had multiple opportunities, yet it seemed content to follow, to observe, to frighten rather than harm. Maybe it was just curious, I suggested, not believing it myself. Maybe we weren't what it was looking for. Or maybe a darker part of my mind whispered, it got exactly what it wanted from us. Our fear, our panic, our fundamental understanding that the world contained things beyond our comprehension. We drove in silence for several miles, the distance from Moss Glen Falls gradually easing the immediate terror. But a deeper dread remained, a fundamental shift in how I viewed the forests I had once loved. We didn't discuss what happened at Moss Glen Falls when we returned to campus that night. By unspoken agreement, we separated at the dormitory entrance with mumbled goodbyes, each retreating to process the experience alone. In the days that followed, Jasmine and I tried to rationalize what we had encountered. We researched local wildlife, hunting forums, even Vermont folklore, searching for some explanation that would fit within our understanding of reality. Maybe it was sick, Jasmine suggested during one of our attempts at discussion. Chronic wasting disease can make deer behave strangely. CWD doesn't make deer stand on hind legs or mimic cat sounds, I countered. There's no disease that explains what we saw. We considered other possibilities. An elaborate prank by local teenagers, a wildlife monitoring robot gone haywire, even shared hallucination brought on by toxic fungi we might have inadvertently touched. None of these explanations satisfied either of us, but they were preferable to accepting what our experience suggested, that something existed in those Vermont woods that defied natural law. Jasmine transferred to a university in Connecticut the following semester. We maintained contact for a while through text messages and social media, but our communications were always strained, shadowed by the unspoken memory of what we had witnessed together. Eventually, we drifted apart, as if the bond forged by our shared experience was too painful to maintain. I remained at the University of Vermont, completing my degree, but I never returned to Moss Glen Falls. In fact, I found myself avoiding forests altogether, choosing urban parks for exercise, taking longer routes on highways rather than scenic drives through wooded areas. When friends suggested hiking trips, I invented excuses. Too much homework, a previous commitment, a sudden headache. The incident changed me in subtle but profound ways. I became hyper-vigilant in natural settings, constantly scanning tree lines for movement, startling at unexpected sounds. My sleep was frequently disturbed by nightmares featuring those glowing eyes, that unnatural laughter. I developed a particular aversion to deer, unable to view even the most innocuous roadside doe without my heart rate accelerating. After graduation, I moved to Pennsylvania for work, a deliberate choice to distance myself from Vermont's expansive forests. My apartment in Philadelphia is surrounded by concrete and steel, the nearest substantial wooded area miles away. This brings me comfort in ways I find difficult to explain to others. I've attempted to research similar encounters over the years, spending countless hours on obscure forums and websites dedicated to unexplained phenomena. Occasionally, I find accounts that echo elements of our experience: unusual animal behavior, strange sounds in remote forests, momentary glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Most are easily dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but some contain details too specific, too similar to what we witnessed to be coincidence. 4 years have passed since that day at Moss Glen Falls. I've largely rebuilt my life, created a version of normality that doesn't include frequent thoughts of what happened. I've even begun dating someone who enjoys outdoor activities, though I carefully steer our excursions toward open fields and beaches rather than forests. But sometimes, in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I find myself back on that dark trail, face to face with something wearing the shape of a deer but fundamentally other. In those moments, the carefully constructed rational explanations fall away, and I'm left with the terrifying possibility that what we encountered was something beyond our current understanding, something that exists in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. I still receive occasional texts from Jasmine, usually around the anniversary of our encounter. Brief messages checking that I'm okay, that I haven't returned to Moss Glen. I always respond with reassurances, never mentioning that I sometimes hear that distorted cat sound in perfectly ordinary situations, a radio being tuned, static on a phone call, the particular cry of certain birds at dusk. Whatever we encountered that day, it left an indelible mark on both of us. Not a physical scar, but something deeper. A fracture in our understanding of what is possible, what is real. A reminder that perhaps the ancient human fear of dark forests isn't merely cultural superstition but evolutionary wisdom. I'm sharing this account not to frighten you, but as a warning. Most of Vermont's wilderness is exactly what it appears to be: beautiful, peaceful, worthy of respect but not fear. But there are places, moments, where something else bleeds through, where the boundaries between what should exist and what does exist become dangerously thin. If you find yourself on a forest trail as darkness falls, and you hear sounds that shouldn't be there, laughter where there should be none, animal calls that sound almost but not quite right, don't investigate, don't seek proof. Turn around, return to safety, and count yourself fortunate, because some knowledge comes at too high a price. Some encounters leave shadows that never fully fade, and some creatures that walk in the Vermont woods were never meant to be understood by human minds. I never considered myself particularly superstitious until the events of October 2019. My life had been relatively ordinary up to that point. I'd moved to a small house on the outskirts of Pinewood Valley 3 years prior, seeking respite from the constant noise and congestion of city life. The property was modest but comfortable, nestled against the border of Westridge Forest, a sprawling woodland that stretched for miles beyond my backyard. My only companion was Winston, an obstinate but lovable pug I'd adopted shortly after relocating. He provided the perfect balance of companionship without complication. Our routine was simple and predictable. Morning walks along the forest edge, my remote work as a technical writer throughout the day, and evenings spent on the back porch watching the sunset filter through the trees. The locals had occasionally mentioned peculiarities about the forest, warnings delivered with the casual nonchalance of those accustomed to rural legends. Don't venture too deep after dark, the elderly cashier at the general store had advised when I first moved in. Sound travels strangely in there. I had dismissed these comments as the typical small-town folklore meant to entertain outsiders. That autumn had been particularly beautiful. The forest had transformed into a tapestry of amber, crimson, and gold. The days grew shorter, and the nights brought a penetrating chill that required an extra log in the fireplace. The isolation that had once seemed therapeutic began to take on a different quality as darkness fell earlier each evening, shrouding the woods in impenetrable shadow by 6 p.m. Winston had developed a newfound fascination with the forest edge, often sitting motionless at the property line, his squat body tense with attention, ears perked toward the darkness. I attributed this behavior to the increased wildlife activity. Deer and foxes frequently emerged at dusk, and the squirrels were frantic in their preparations for winter. On the night everything changed, I'd been working late, my attention consumed by a technical manual deadline. When I finally emerged from my home office, I realized Winston wasn't in his usual spot on the couch. A quick scan of the house confirmed my suspicion. He'd managed to nudge open the back door I'd left slightly ajar earlier in the evening. The temperature had dropped considerably, and a dense mist had risen from the forest floor, creeping across my property like ghostly fingers. With mounting concern, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the back porch, calling Winston's name into the darkness. The beam of light cut ineffectively through the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead before diffusing into nothingness. Little did I know that my quiet life was about to be irreversibly disrupted, that the boundary between known and unknown was far thinner than I had ever imagined, and that some mysteries, once encountered, refused to be forgotten. "Winston!" I called again, my voice echoing against the wall of trees. The mist swallowed the sound, making it seem muffled and distant even to my own ears. Stepping off the porch, I swept the flashlight across the yard, catching glimpses of fallen leaves swirling in the gentle breeze. A movement caught my eye. Winston darting between shrubs at the forest edge, something clutched in his mouth. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by irritation at his disobedience. "Winston, come here now," I commanded, but he only looked at me, his eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, before trotting farther along the tree line. Muttering under my breath, I followed, the damp grass soaking through my slippers. As I approached, I could see he had captured a large maple leaf, its stem protruding from his mouth like a victory cigar. When I reached for him, he darted away, clearly enjoying this impromptu game of chase. "This isn't funny," I warned, though I couldn't help but smile at his playful defiance. I lunged forward and missed, my hand grazing his back as he scampered a few feet ahead, stopping to ensure I was still playing. The game continued for several minutes, Winston leading me progressively closer to the forest's edge. The fog was thicker here, clinging to the tree trunks and creating ghostly silhouettes in the darkness. My property lights were now distant blurs, muted through the mist. I was about to make another attempt to catch him when it happened. The sound emerged so subtly at first that I questioned whether I was actually hearing anything at all. A delicate tinkling, like the lightest kiss of crystal against crystal. It grew steadily more pronounced. Not louder, exactly, but more present, as though tuning into a frequency that had always been there. Within seconds, the single note multiplied exponentially. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of sounds coalesced into what I can only describe as a crystalline symphony. It resembled wind chimes, but with an impossible intricacy and harmony that no manufactured instrument could produce. The notes overlapped in patterns that seemed simultaneously random and precisely orchestrated, creating harmonies that shifted between eerily beautiful and profoundly unsettling. The sound emanated from within the forest, but its precise location was impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me completely, yet also giving the distinct impression of distance, as though originating from deep within the woods while simultaneously manifesting directly beside my ears. For those brief seconds, I stood frozen, mesmerized by the otherworldly melody. Winston, however, had a very different reaction. His playful demeanor vanished instantly. The leaf dropped from his mouth as his body went rigid, eyes wide with an unmistakable emotion I'd never seen in him before. Pure, primal fear. Then, with the same abruptness with which it began, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and somehow more unnerving than the mysterious chimes had been. Moving with sudden urgency, I scooped Winston into my arms. His small body trembled against my chest, a low whine escaping his throat. Without looking back, I hurried toward the house, unable to shake the feeling that we were being observed from the darkened trees behind us. Sleep evaded me that night. Winston refused to leave my side, pressing himself against me with unusual insistence. His normally robust snoring was replaced by alert vigilance, his head rising at the slightest sound outside. I repeatedly told myself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps wind moving through an unusual rock formation, or some experimental weather equipment installed by the forestry department. By morning, the experience had taken on the quality of a strange dream, diluted by daylight and rational thought. Yet Winston's behavior remained altered. He refused to approach the back door for his morning routine, instead whining by the front entrance, his nails clicking anxiously on the hardwood floor. After finishing my work assignments that afternoon, I found myself drawn to my computer with a singular purpose. Fingers hovering over the keyboard, I hesitated before typing. Strange wind chime sounds forest night. The search returned thousands of results, mostly advertisements for actual wind chimes or nature sound recordings. I refined my search. Unexplained musical sounds, woods not wind chimes. This yielded more interesting results, including forum discussions about strange acoustic phenomena in natural settings. I clicked through several pages before a Reddit thread from 2017 caught my attention. Help. Weird wind chime. Sounds coming from forest behind my house. My heart rate accelerated as I opened the thread. The original poster, username WoodsEdge88, described an experience disturbingly similar to mine. Lasted about 5 to 7 seconds, sounded like hundreds of crystal wind chimes all going off at once, but with this weird harmony to it. Not random tinkling. Almost like it was communicating something. Dog freaked out completely. Happened twice now, always after sunset. The comments section was a mixture of skepticism, supernatural theories, and scientific explanations. Several users shared comparable experiences from different geographical locations. One comment stood out from a user claiming to be an acoustic engineer. What you're describing could be a specific type of atmospheric anomaly. Under certain temperature and humidity conditions, sound can travel in unusual ways through forested areas. Natural elements like hollow tree trunks, rock formations, and even leaf configurations can create resonant chambers that amplify and distort ambient sounds. This explanation seemed plausible, yet something about it felt insufficient. I continued researching, hours slipping by unnoticed as I delved deeper into acoustic phenomena, forest mysteries, and unexplained sounds. I discovered numerous accounts spanning decades, some scientific, others wrapped in folklore, of similar occurrences in wooded areas across the country. A pattern emerged among the accounts. The sounds typically occurred during seasonal transitions, particularly autumn. They were most often reported near old-growth forests, and in almost every case, animals reacted with fear or agitation before humans detected anything unusual. As evening approached, I realized I had spent over 5 hours consuming these digital breadcrumbs, following them deeper into increasingly obscure corners of the internet. My neck ached from hunching over the screen, and my eyes burned from the prolonged focus. Winston had remained unusually subdued all day, watching me with an intensity that seemed to reflect my growing unease. Outside my window, darkness was falling once again. The forest stood as an impenetrable wall of shadow beyond my yard. Despite the mounting evidence suggesting I wasn't alone in my experience, this knowledge provided little comfort. Instead, it planted a seed of dread that would continue to grow in the days ahead. a suspicion that whatever had produced those sounds might return, and that its manifestation might not be limited to auditory phenomena. The following days brought a gradual shift in the atmosphere surrounding my home. Small changes accumulated, each insignificant in isolation, but troubling in aggregate. The first notable incident occurred on Thursday morning when I discovered Winston's water bowl completely empty, despite having filled it the previous evening. Initially dismissing it as forgetfulness, I refilled it and continued with my day. That afternoon, while working in my home office, I became aware of an unusual quality to the silence, a pressured sensation in my ears similar to the feeling before a thunderstorm. I glanced outside, expecting to see dark clouds gathering, but the sky remained clear and bright. The sensation passed after several minutes, leaving me vaguely disoriented. By Friday, Winston's behavior had deteriorated further. He began barking at empty corners of rooms, following invisible movements with his eyes, and refusing to be left alone. When I attempted to take him for his usual walk along the driveway, he planted his feet at the end of the front path and wouldn't budge, straining against his leash toward the house with uncharacteristic determination. "What's gotten into you?" I asked, kneeling beside him. His eyes darted repeatedly toward the tree line, though nothing visible warranted such concern. Reluctantly, I cut the walk short and returned inside, where his anxiety noticeably diminished. That evening, while preparing dinner, I noticed 3 distinct scratches on the kitchen window facing the backyard. Thin, parallel lines approximately 4 inches long. They appeared to have been made from the outside, though I couldn't recall any tree branches close enough to cause such marks. I ran my finger along the grooves, finding them surprisingly deep in the glass. Something about their deliberate placement and uniform spacing suggested intention rather than accident. The most disturbing development occurred shortly before midnight. I was reading in bed when the power flickered momentarily, plunging the house into darkness before restoring seconds later. Winston, who had been sleeping at the foot of the bed, immediately became alert, growling toward my bedroom door. I listened intently but heard nothing unusual. As I returned to my book, the distinct sound of footsteps creaked across my front porch. They moved slowly, deliberately from one end to the other, pausing at the area directly in front of my door. Winston's growling intensified, his body rigid with attention. Gathering my courage, I moved to the window overlooking the porch, cautiously pulling back the curtain. The porch light illuminated the wooden boards clearly, revealing nothing but fallen leaves blown against the railing. I watched for several minutes, seeing no movement. Yet the distinct impression of a presence remained. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by mundane house noises that suddenly seemed significant and threatening. Each creak of settling wood, each rustle of wind through nearby branches commanded my full attention. Winston remained vigilant beside me, his reactions confirming that my growing unease wasn't entirely psychological. Saturday morning revealed another troubling discovery, a perfect circle of dead grass in my backyard, approximately 6 feet in diameter. The affected area was completely desiccated, brown and brittle in stark contrast to the healthy lawn surrounding it. No obvious explanation presented itself. No chemical spill, no fire pit, no sign of burrowing animals. Standing at my kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hand, I stared at the circle with mounting apprehension. Its placement seemed deliberate, exactly halfway between my back porch and the forest edge, like a demarcation point between 2 territories. As I watched, a pair of crows landed at its perimeter, hopped around its edge without crossing into the dead zone, then flew away with unusual haste. I found myself increasingly reluctant to leave the house, even to collect mail or take out trash. My rational mind struggled to maintain control, offering explanations for each occurrence: neighborhood teenagers playing pranks, unusual but natural phenomena, my own heightened anxiety manufacturing connections between unrelated events. Yet beneath these reassurances, a more primal understanding was taking hold. Something had noticed us, and whatever boundary had previously existed between its domain and mine was beginning to dissolve. By Sunday night, I had established a makeshift monitoring station at my dining room table. My laptop displayed the feed from a security camera I'd hastily installed above the back door, while a digital voice recorder sat on the windowsill, set to activate with sound. The logical part of my brain recognized these measures as excessive, possibly stemming from isolation-induced paranoia, yet I couldn't dismiss the cumulative strangeness of recent events. Winston had taken to sleeping under the table, emerging only for necessary trips outside, which he conducted with military efficiency before scrambling back through the door. His food remained largely untouched, and the playful demeanor that had characterized him since puppyhood had vanished entirely. At 11:23 p.m., I noticed a distinct drop in temperature throughout the house. The thermostat confirmed a 10-degree decrease despite the heating system running continuously. Condensation formed on the inside of the windows, obscuring my view of the yard. I wiped a clear patch on the glass and peered out at the forest edge, now barely visible in the ambient light from my porch. The fog had returned, thicker than before, behaving against meteorological norms. Instead of forming a blanket across the landscape, it appeared to be flowing from the forest in directed tendrils, slowly advancing across my property like probing fingers. Through the camera feed, I observed how it moved against the slight breeze, defying natural air currents. At 1:47 a.m., Winston suddenly emerged from under the table, hackles raised, staring intensely at the back door. I heard nothing, but the camera feed showed the motion-activated porch light illuminating empty space. The dog began a low, continuous growl unlike any sound I'd heard him make before. The digital thermometer dropped another 8 degrees in 30 seconds. Then it began again, the crystalline symphony, more complex than before. The notes seemed to form patterns just beyond comprehension, like a language hovering at the edge of recognition. The voice recorder's level meter spiked, confirming this was not my imagination, yet when I later analyzed the recording, only static appeared where the sounds should have been. The chimes continued for precisely 17 seconds, concluding with a single pure tone that lingered after the others had ceased. In the silence that followed, I became aware of pressure changes that made my ears pop repeatedly, as though altitude was rapidly shifting. Winston had retreated to the farthest corner of the room, wedged between a bookcase and the wall, his eyes never leaving the back door. Outside, the fog had completely enveloped the yard, pressing against the windows with unnatural density. Through the camera feed, I could see the porch light struggling to penetrate more than a few inches into the mist. At 2:13 a.m., a series of tapping sounds began against the kitchen window, light, rhythmic contacts that continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. When morning came, inspection revealed no marks, no evidence of branches or debris that might have caused such sounds. I spent the remainder of the night documenting everything in precise detail: times, temperature readings, Winston's reactions, the characteristics of the sounds and mist. What had begun as casual notes evolved into pages of observations, diagrams, and attempts to identify patterns. Looking over these writings in the harsh light of dawn, I recognized the documenting behavior of someone desperately trying to impose order on inexplicable events. Monday brought no respite. Working became impossible, my concentration fractured by hypervigilance. Every sound from outside commanded immediate attention. The dark circles under my eyes testified to accumulating nights of interrupted sleep. Winston refused to eat entirely now, drinking only when I placed water directly in front of him. The forest watched. This anthropomorphizing of nature would have seemed absurd to me weeks earlier, but now it felt like the only accurate description. The entire woodland seemed oriented toward my house, focused with patient, inexorable attention. Whatever scientific explanation might exist for the sounds and other phenomena, I could no longer deny the overwhelming sensation of being observed by something ancient and utterly alien to human experience. That evening, gathering the last reserves of my rational thinking, I made a decision. I would confront whatever was happening directly. I would enter the forest at nightfall, when the conditions seemed most conducive to the phenomena, and seek answers rather than continue this passive documentation of escalating events. The foolishness of this plan was evident even as I formulated it, yet the alternative, continuing to wait as the boundary between observer and observed eroded further, seemed far more terrifying. Preparation became a form of meditation. I laid out equipment on the kitchen table with methodical precision. A powerful flashlight with fresh batteries, a smaller backup light, my phone with GPS tracking enabled, a digital recorder, a multi-tool, and a can of bear spray purchased during my early days in the house but never needed. I dressed in layers despite the mild evening temperature, some instinctive part of me anticipating the unnatural cold that had accompanied previous incidents. Winston watched these preparations with visible distress, following me from room to room as I gathered supplies. When I approached the back door at 8:47 p.m., backpack shouldered and flashlight in hand, he positioned himself in my path, his stocky body blocking the exit with surprising effectiveness for his small size. "I have to know," I told him, feeling slightly ridiculous for explaining myself to a dog, yet needing to articulate my reasoning aloud. "We can't keep living like this." His plaintive whine nearly broke my resolve. I secured him in the bedroom with fresh water, his favorite blanket, and a peanut butter-filled toy that would normally occupy him for hours. His mournful barking followed me down the hallway, diminishing as I closed the back door behind me. Twilight had nearly completed its transition to full darkness. The forest edge, normally a soft boundary of gradual shadow, now presented an unnaturally sharp delineation between my property and the woods. The circle of dead grass had expanded slightly since morning, its perimeter now perfectly aligned with the drip line of the outermost trees. I activated the voice recorder, speaking clearly. October 14th, 2019, 8:52 p.m. Beginning investigation of sound phenomena at forest boundary. The formal, scientific tone felt like a talisman against fear, a pretense that this was a rational inquiry rather than a possibly foolhardy confrontation with the unknown. The mist began forming as I approached the tree line, materializing not gradually, but in sudden, localized pockets that coalesced into larger formations. It moved with purpose, neither drifting with the breeze nor settling in topographical low points as natural fog would. At the exact boundary where my maintained lawn met the forest undergrowth, I hesitated. Some primal instinct urged retreat, yet intellectual curiosity and the need for resolution pulled me forward. The first step beyond this threshold felt momentous, as though crossing an invisible barrier that had previously been respected by both sides. The forest interior was surprisingly navigable, the leaf litter creating a soft carpet that muffled my footsteps. Old-growth trees towered overhead, their canopy blocking ambient light from the night sky. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate less distance than it should, the light absorbed rather than reflected by the surroundings. I proceeded approximately 50 yards along what appeared to be a natural pathway, noting that the mist thickened with each step, constraining visibility to an increasingly smaller radius around me. The temperature dropped steadily, my breath soon forming visible clouds. The display on my phone indicated it was 43 degrees F, though it had been 68 degrees in my yard minutes earlier. At a small clearing, I stopped to document my observations, speaking quietly into the recorder. The silence was absolute. No insect sounds, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of nocturnal birds. This absence of natural forest ambience created an acoustic vacuum that seemed to press against my eardrums. The first chime sounded directly behind me, a single crystalline note of perfect clarity. I turned sharply, flashlight beam cutting through the mist, revealing nothing but trees and undergrowth. A second note followed from a different direction, then another, and another, until the sound surrounded me completely. Unlike previous occurrences, this manifestation built gradually, each new tone adding to the complex harmony rather than emerging simultaneously. The effect was that of being encircled by an approaching presence, or many presences, that communicated through these sounds. For the first time, I perceived a distinct pattern in the notes, a structure too regular to be random, too complex to be easily classified. The sensation of language returned stronger than before, not words, but pure meaning conveyed through tonal relationships that bypassed normal auditory processing. My recording equipment emitted a high-pitched squeal before shutting down completely. The flashlight flickered and dimmed, but continued functioning at reduced capacity. Most alarmingly, my phone screen displayed rapidly changing nonsensical characters before going dark. The mist thickened until it acquired an almost tactile quality, pressing against my skin with slight electric sensation. Within this clouded environment, shadows moved. Not solid forms, but variations in density that suggested presence without confirming it visually. I stood motionless at the center of this phenomenon, fear giving way to a strange, detached fascination. The temperature continued to drop until the mist itself began crystallizing in the air, forming intricate geometric patterns that hung suspended before dissolving. Then came the revelation, not through sight or conventional sound, but through a sudden understanding that seemed to bypass my senses entirely. The forest was not merely a collection of trees, but a vast, interconnected system, ancient beyond human conception, with capabilities for perception and communication that operated on principles entirely foreign to our experience. What we casually termed woods or forest was merely the visible portion of an entity or collective of entities that existed primarily below ground, in the vast mycological networks connecting all plant life in complex symbiotic relationships. The sounds were merely the most accessible manifestation of communication efforts directed toward the strange bipedal organism that had established itself at the perimeter of this ancient system. This understanding arrived not as speculation, but as direct knowledge, imposing itself with the undeniable clarity of lived experience. In that moment, I comprehended that I had never been the observer of mysterious phenomena. I had always been the observed, studied with patient curiosity by an intelligence so fundamentally different from human consciousness that communication between us was nearly impossible. Nearly, but not entirely. The crystalline symphony reached a crescendo, individual tones merging into a single harmonic whole that resonated through my body rather than simply entering through my ears. The mist solidified further, forming translucent structures that resembled organic architecture, not buildings, but something more akin to coral formations or massive fungal growths, continuously morphing and adapting. Within this transformed environment, normal sensory processing became irrelevant. Conventional boundaries between seeing, hearing, and feeling dissolved completely. Information transferred directly, bypassing language entirely. I understood without being told that this phenomenon represented an extraordinary effort at cross-species communication, a temporary bridge constructed at considerable energy expenditure. What followed was not conversation in any recognized sense, but an exchange of fundamental realities. The forest entity, or network of entities, conveyed concepts for which human language has no adequate terminology. The sensation of experiencing time through seasonal rhythms rather than linear progression. The awareness of existing simultaneously as individual units and as components of a vast collective consciousness. The perception of human development, our roads, houses, and infrastructure, as a rapidly spreading, potentially harmful anomaly in patterns that had remained stable for millennia. The complex relationship between different forest systems separated geographically, but connected through migratory wildlife, atmospheric patterns, and even human activity that unknowingly transported spores, seeds, and microorganisms between locations. Most significantly, I understood their growing concern about changes in the ecological balance, warming temperatures, altered precipitation patterns, and the introduction of non-native species that disrupted ancient symbiotic relationships. In return, without conscious effort, I conveyed human perspective. Our brief lifespans that necessitated rapid adaptation and development. Our individualized consciousness that struggled to comprehend collective existence. Our technological progression that often occurred without full understanding of ecological consequences. This exchange occurred outside normal temporal constraints. What seemed like an extended interaction might have lasted minutes or hours. My watch had stopped functioning, and ordinary time perception had become irrelevant within this altered state. Throughout this communion, I remained aware of my physical form standing in the forest clearing, yet simultaneously experienced existence from perspectives entirely foreign to human consciousness, sensing sunlight not as illumination, but as sustenance, experiencing rainfall not as weather but as communication medium, perceiving seasonal changes not as external conditions but as phases of self. This profound connection reached natural conclusion as suddenly as it had begun. The harmonic tones separated back into individual notes, then diminished in sequence rather than simultaneously. The mist structures dissolved gradually, returning to natural fog that behaved according to normal atmospheric principles. Normal sensory perception reasserted itself. The forest around me returned to its ordinary appearance, though my understanding of it had been irrevocably transformed. My equipment reactivated spontaneously, the digital recorder capturing the tail end of the phenomenon, the final crystalline notes fading into normal forest ambience. I stood motionless, integration of this experience requiring considerable mental effort. The mundane details of physical existence, the dampness of my clothes, the restored brightness of my flashlight, the renewed functionality of my phone, seemed trivial compared to the revelations I had just received. Checking the time, I discovered that 3 hours and 22 minutes had elapsed since I entered the forest. What had felt like both an eternity and an instant had occupied a specific, measurable duration. This anchoring in ordinary reality provided necessary grounding as I began the walk back to my house. The return journey occurred without incident, the forest now exhibiting normal nocturnal characteristics. Occasional rustling in underbrush, distant owl calls, the gentle movement of leaves in the breeze. The boundary between forest and yard no longer presented as an unnatural demarcation, but had returned to its proper state as a gradual transition zone. Winston greeted me with frantic relief, his anxiety visibly dissipating as he circled my legs, sniffing intently at my clothes and shoes. The house felt ordinary again, the oppressive atmosphere that had accumulated over previous days now absent. The temperature had normalized, and the condensation had cleared from the windows. I showered mechanically, changed into clean clothes, and sat at my dining table with a notebook, attempting to record what had transpired before the extraordinary clarity of direct communication began inevitably fading into the imprecision of memory and language. 3 months have passed since that October night. Winter has transformed the landscape, covering the forest in pristine snow that muffles sound and simplifies the visual complexity of the woods. Winston has returned to his normal behavior patterns, playful, occasionally stubborn, but free from the intense anxiety that had gripped him during those strange autumn days. The mysterious phenomena have not recurred. No unusual sounds have emerged from the forest. No unexplained mist has formed in my yard. No temperature anomalies have affected my house. By conventional standards, life has returned to normal. Yet, normal has acquired an entirely new definition. Though the direct communication experience has not repeated, its effects have permanently altered my perception of my surroundings. The forest is no longer simply scenery or habitat, but a complex living system with its own form of awareness that operates on timescales and principles fundamentally different from human experience. I've spent countless hours researching mycological networks, the wood wide web of fungal connections that link trees and cooperative systems, allowing them to share resources and information across distances. Scientific literature confirms aspects of what I experience directly, that forests function not as collections of individual organisms, but as interconnected superorganisms with sophisticated communication capabilities. What science doesn't yet acknowledge, at least not in mainstream publications, is the possibility that these systems possess a form of consciousness or intentionality. The recognition that awareness can exist in forms entirely unlike human consciousness remains a fringe concept, relegated to philosophical speculation rather than scientific inquiry. I've been cautious about sharing my experience. A few tentative conversations with close friends yielded the expected skepticism. polite but clear disbelief, occasionally masked as concern for my mental well-being. One attempt to describe the event anonymously in an online forum resulted in a mixture of dismissive comments, paranormal enthusiasts seeking sensationalism rather than understanding, and a few thoughtful responses suggesting similar experiences. The circle of dead grass in my yard has disappeared, now covered by snow that will eventually melt to reveal new growth in spring. The scratches on my window remain, 3 parallel lines that serve as tangible evidence that something unusual occurred, though they could be explained away by mundane causes. Winston and I still walk the property daily, though now we regularly venture to the forest edge without the fear that previously accompanied such excursions. Sometimes I stand at the boundary, watching the interplay of light and shadow among the trees, wondering if communication might someday resume in a form I could comprehend, without the extraordinary conditions that enabled our initial exchange. I've come to understand that the wind chime sounds represented just one aspect of a complex communication system that operates continuously, mostly beyond human perceptual capabilities. Under specific conditions, certain atmospheric combinations, particular alignments of natural elements, maybe even states of human receptivity, these communications occasionally become perceptible to our limited senses. The forest has not attempted to contact me again, at least not in ways I can consciously recognize. Perhaps our exchange satisfied whatever curiosity prompted the initial outreach. Perhaps the energy required for cross-species communication makes frequent attempts impractical. Or perhaps communication continues in subtler forms that I've yet to recognize. Remains is a profound shift in my relationship with the natural world, not a romantic idealization of nature, but a sober recognition of its complexity, intelligence, and fundamental otherness. The forest exists neither as resource to be exploited, nor pristine wilderness to be preserved in artificial stasis, but as an ancient intelligence following evolutionary imperatives and adaptive strategies developed over millions of years. I continue documenting my observations and reflections, not for publication or validation, but as a personal record of ongoing integration. The experience defies conventional categories of real versus imagined, existing in a liminal space where direct perception transcends the limitations of language and cultural frameworks. Winston stirs beside me now, indicating his desire for our evening walk. Outside, twilight approaches. The forest stands as it always has, neither menacing nor benevolent, simply present in its immense, patient existence. As we step onto the porch, the last light of day filters through bare branches, casting intricate patterns across the snow-covered ground. I listen carefully, not expecting but always open to the possibility that the chimes might return, bringing with them another glimpse into a form of consciousness so unlike our own, yet sharing this small planet in delicate, complex relationship. In their absence, the ordinary sounds of the winter forest, branches creaking in the cold, distant calls of returning birds, the soft padding of Winston's paws on packed snow, form their own kind of music, subtle but meaningful for those who have learned to truly listen. My name is Zachary, and 5 years ago when I was 13, I experienced something that changed me forever. What began as an exciting birthday celebration turned into a nightmare that haunts me to this day. It was October 2020 when my grandfather and 2 uncles, I'll call them Uncle Ray and Uncle Devin, decided to take me on a special hunting trip to celebrate my birthday. Our destination was a remote property deep in the northern Minnesota woods near 2 harbors. We packed our gear into my grandfather's weathered Ford F-250 and set off on what should have been a routine weekend getaway. The 6-hour drive from our home was filled with stories of previous hunting trips, jokes, and my grandfather's endless wisdom about tracking wildlife. I remember staring out the window as the urban landscape gradually gave way to dense forests. The autumn colors painted the trees in brilliant shades of red and orange, a beautiful sight that would soon become the backdrop for terror. "We're almost there, kid," Uncle Ray said, turning down a narrow dirt road. Your first real hunting trip. You excited? I nodded enthusiastically. I had been waiting for this moment since I was old enough to understand what hunting was. In our family, it was a rite of passage, a tradition passed down through generations. The truck jostled as we navigated the increasingly rough terrain. As we approached the entrance to the property, something caught my eye. A no hunting sign bent at an odd angle, as if crushed by tremendous force. The metal was warped downward, suggesting something incredibly heavy had smashed it. "What happened to that sign?" I asked, pointing. Uncle Devin glanced at it as we drove past. "Probably some drunk locals or bears messing around. Nothing to worry about." But something about the sign troubled me. It wasn't just bent. It looked deliberately damaged. We continued down the path until we reached a small clearing where a basic hunting cabin stood. The structure was simple, a single-room wooden building with a small porch and a tin roof that had weathered countless seasons. We spent the next hour unpacking our gear and settling in. The cabin had 2 bunk beds, a small wood-burning stove, and a table with 4 chairs. It was rustic but comfortable enough for our 3-night stay. My grandfather started preparing dinner, his famous venison stew with vegetables from his garden, while my uncles retrieved the 4-wheelers from the trailer. "I'm going to check out that sign," I told them, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Don't wander too far," my grandfather cautioned. "Dinner will be ready soon, and it gets dark early out here." I nodded and headed back toward the entrance. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls breaking the silence. When I reached the sign, I examined it more closely. The damage was strange. The metal was crushed as if in a giant vise, and on the backside I noticed 4 long, deep gouges. They looked like claw marks, but much larger than any bear could make. Around the base of the sign, I spotted something else: large footprints in the soft earth. They resembled canine prints but were unnaturally large, about the size of softballs. My heart began to beat faster as I studied them. Whatever had made these tracks was massive. I'd grown up learning about wildlife. I knew the prints of deer, bears, wolves, and coyotes, but these belonged to none of them. They were too big, too deep, the impression suggesting something impossibly heavy. A sudden feeling of being watched washed over me. The forest, which had been alive with ambient sounds moments before, fell eerily silent. I looked up from the tracks and scanned the tree line, seeing nothing but dense forest. Still, the sensation persisted, eyes on me, calculating, waiting. I hurried back to the cabin, not running but walking briskly, repeatedly glancing over my shoulder. My grandfather was stirring the stew when I entered. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. I hesitated. Would they believe me? "No," I lied. "Just looking around." That night, we built a bonfire using branches from 2 large pine trees my uncles had cut down earlier. As we sat around the flames, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, I couldn't shake my unease. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, as if the wildlife had abandoned the area. "It's too quiet," I finally said. Uncle Ray paused mid-story. "What do you mean?" "Listen," I told him. "No owls, no crickets, nothing." The 3 adults fell silent, noticing the absence of sound for the first time. "That is strange," my grandfather admitted. "Usually can't get the critters to shut up out here." Then it hit us. A stench so overpowering it seemed to physically assault us. The smell was like a combination of wet dog, decomposition, and ammonia, so intense it made my eyes water. Uncle Ray doubled over and vomited into the dirt. "What the hell is that?" Uncle Devin gasped, covering his nose with his shirt. "Probably a dead animal nearby," my grandfather suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Wind must be carrying it." But there was no wind. The air was completely still, and the smell had appeared suddenly, as if whatever was producing it had just arrived. For 15 long minutes, we endured the stench before it vanished as abruptly as it had come. We retired to the cabin shortly after, the pleasant evening spoiled. As I lay in my bunk that night, listening to my grandfather's snoring, I couldn't stop thinking about the bent sign, the massive tracks, and that terrible smell. Sleep came eventually, but it was filled with dreams of being hunted through endless woods by something I couldn't see but could sense was always just behind me. Morning brought crisp air and clear skies. After a hearty breakfast of bacon, eggs, and hash browns, we planned our day. My grandfather and Uncle Devin would set up hunting blinds on the eastern edge of the property, while Uncle Ray would take me out on the four-wheelers to familiarize me with the terrain. Keep your eyes open for deer signs, Uncle Ray instructed as we mounted the ATVs. This time of year they should be plentiful. I nodded, securing my helmet. At 13, I wasn't old enough to hunt with a rifle yet, but I'd been practicing with my grandfather's .22 for years and had excellent marksmanship. For this trip, they'd allowed me to carry my grandfather's Colt 1911, a responsibility that filled me with pride. Make sure you keep the safety on, Uncle Ray reminded me as I checked the pistol. It's just a precaution out here. Bears can get curious. We spent the morning exploring the property's extensive trail system. The four-wheelers handled the rough terrain with ease, climbing steep hills and navigating dense sections of forest. By midday, we had covered most of the eastern section and stopped by a small stream for lunch. I'm going to head back to help your grandfather, Uncle Ray said after we'd eaten. You want to come, or would you like to explore a bit more on your own? I chose to continue exploring. Uncle Ray hesitated, then nodded. Stay on the marked trails and be back before dark. Take this walkie-talkie and check in every hour. He handed me the device. And Zachary, be careful. After he left, I decided to investigate the paved road that ran alongside our property. It was rarely used, a service road for the forestry department. But I was curious about what lay beyond our immediate surroundings. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees as I drove, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground. About 2 miles down the road, I stopped the ATV to take a break and relieve myself. Stepping into the woods a few yards from the road, I suddenly realized something was wrong. The forest had gone silent again. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of leaves rustling. Just absolute, oppressive silence. Then the smell returned. That same putrid stench from the night before, only stronger now, more intense. I fumbled for the pistol in my waistband, heart pounding. Before I could draw the weapon, movement caught my eye. Something was emerging from the dense undergrowth about 30 yards away. At first I thought it was a bear, black fur, massive build. But as it fully emerged, I realized it was something else entirely. The creature moved on all fours, but its proportions were wrong for a bear. Its back legs were longer than its front, and its shoulders were unnaturally broad. Its head was shaped like a wolf's, with a long snout and pointed ears, but much larger than any wolf I'd ever seen. And its eyes, amber-colored and filled with an intelligence that sent ice through my veins. I stood frozen, unable to move as the creature studied me. Then it did something impossible. It rose up on its hind legs, standing nearly 8 feet tall. The movement was accompanied by a series of sickening popping sounds, as if its joints were reconfiguring. In that moment, rational thought abandoned me. I wasn't looking at a bear or a wolf. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Its fur was a dark, grayish-black that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Those eyes locked onto mine, and I felt naked, exposed, as if it could see straight through to my core. My survival instincts finally kicked in. I sprinted back to the ATV, which I'd left running, and jumped on. The creature dropped to all fours and charged, moving with horrifying speed. I gunned the engine, the tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase on the pavement. The ATV shot forward, speedometer climbing, 25, 30, 35 miles per hour. But in my side mirror, I could see the creature giving chase, its massive form covering ground with impossible speed. It was keeping pace with me. With one hand on the handlebars, I managed to pull the Colt from my waistband and release the safety. The ATV hit 45 mph, its top speed, but the creature was still closing the gap. In desperation, I twisted around and fired a shot. The report was deafening, but I couldn't tell if I'd hit my target. The creature let out a sound that wasn't quite a howl and wasn't quite a scream. A high-pitched, yet simultaneously deep vocalization that seemed to vibrate through my body. It lunged, powerful legs propelling it through the air toward me. I jerked the handlebars, making a sharp turn onto a connecting road. The creature missed me by inches, its massive form crashing into the underbrush. I fired 2 more rounds as it emerged and resumed the chase. I knew I hit it, saw the impact of the bullets against its body, but it barely slowed. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I continued firing, each shot finding its mark but seemingly having little effect. With only 1 bullet left, I made a desperate decision. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the ATV to a skidding halt, and turned to face the oncoming nightmare. It was about 60 yards away now, still charging but moving more awkwardly, perhaps affected by my shots after all. I raised the pistol, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the creature directly in the right eye. It crashed to the ground with such force that I felt the vibration through the ATV's frame, tumbling and rolling before coming to rest in a motionless heap on the pavement. For several minutes, I sat paralyzed on the four-wheeler, engine idling, waiting for the creature to move. It didn't. Slowly, cautiously, I approached. The massive form lay still, black fluid seeping from its wounds. Up close, it was even more terrifying. Muscles bulging beneath its fur, massive claws extending from its fingertips, jaws filled with teeth that would make a shark envious. I needed to be certain it was dead. In the storage compartment of the ATV, I found a machete we used for clearing trails. With shaking hands, I approached the creature and drove the blade into its other eye, destroying what I hoped was its brain. The creature was impossibly heavy, at least 400 pounds of dense muscle and bone. It took every ounce of my strength to drag it off the road and into the trees. By the time I finished, my clothes were soaked with sweat and the creature's dark blood. The ride back to camp was a blur. My mind couldn't process what I'd just experienced. What was that thing? How could it move so fast? Why didn't it die when I shot it repeatedly? When I arrived at camp, my family was gathered around the fire, preparing dinner. I parked the ATV, trying to appear normal despite my shaking hands and the blood on my clothes. "What happened to you?" Uncle Devin asked, noticing my disheveled state. "Fell off the four-wheeler," I lied. "Got a bit scraped up, but I'm fine." "You're being careful out there, right?" my grandfather asked, his eyes narrowing with concern. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "I'm going to clean up." In the small bathroom attached to the cabin, I scrubbed the blood from my hands and changed my clothes, hiding the stained garments at the bottom of my bag. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I tell them? Would they believe me? Would they think I was crazy or making up stories? I decided to keep quiet for now. Without proof, my story would sound like the imagination of an overexcited teenager. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd killed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, listening to every sound outside the cabin walls. I had retrieved an extra magazine for the Colt and loaded it with hollow point rounds. The pistol was under my pillow, and my grandfather's .243 hunting rifle was propped against the wall beside my bunk. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep filled with nightmares of amber eyes and gnashing teeth. The smell of bacon and coffee woke me the next morning. For a blissful moment, I thought perhaps the previous day had been a terrible dream. Then I checked my pistol. Hollow points loaded, just as I remembered doing. It had been real. After breakfast, I walked to where I'd parked the ATV the night before. There, carved into the plastic body panel, was a single long gouge, like a claw mark. My grandfather noticed it later and gave me a stern lecture about being careless with expensive equipment. Throughout the day, I remained vigilant, keeping my weapons close. The smell returned briefly around dusk, and my heart nearly stopped. If there was one of those creatures, could there be more? A pack of them roaming these woods? I decided to check on the carcass. Telling my family I was going for a quick ride, I returned to where I dragged the creature's body. What I found, or rather didn't find, turned my blood to ice. The body was gone. No blood, no fur, nothing remained except some disturbed earth where I dragged it. Had someone found and removed it? Had it somehow survived? The questions tormented me as I sped back to camp, unwilling to remain in that spot a moment longer than necessary. The next day dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood. My family noticed my subdued behavior but attributed it to being tired from the previous day's explorations. After breakfast, Uncle Ray suggested we do some target practice. "We'll start hunting properly tomorrow," he said. "Today's about making sure you're comfortable with the rifles." We set up targets, empty cans and bottles, along a fallen log about 50 yards from camp. My grandfather handed me his .22 rifle. "Let's see if you remember what I taught you," he said with a smile. Despite my distracted state, muscle memory took over. I hit 9 out of 10 targets, earning approving nods from my uncles and grandfather. "Not bad," Uncle Ray said. "You'll make a fine hunter yet." After lunch, I volunteered to hunt for small game for dinner. With the .22 and my pistol, I ventured into the woods alone, against my better judgment. Something was drawing me back, a need to confirm what I'd seen, to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. The forest was alive with normal sounds again. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of wind through leaves. It felt almost peaceful, though I remained on high alert, scanning continuously for movement. I managed to bag 2 rabbits and a squirrel, enough for a decent stew. As I was field dressing the rabbits, I heard it. The same bone-chilling howl scream from before. The sound echoed through the trees, raising goosebumps along my arms and neck. The forest fell silent once more. I packed my game quickly and prepared to leave when I noticed the trees around me beginning to shake. Branches snapped and fell as something large moved through the canopy. Heart pounding, I looked up. There it was. The same creature I thought I'd killed, or perhaps another like it. Its right eye was a ruined socket, exactly where my bullet had struck. Somehow, impossibly, it had survived. A vicious snarl distorted its wolf-like features as it glared down at me with its remaining eye. I didn't hesitate. I'd already turned the ATV around out of habit, a safety measure my grandfather had taught me, and I gunned the engine, racing back toward camp. The creature pursued through the trees, leaping from branch to branch with unnatural agility despite its massive size. I burst into the clearing where our cabin stood, the four-wheeler's engine screaming as I pushed it to its limits. My family looked up in alarm as I skidded to a stop. "We need to leave," I gasped. "Now. Pack everything. We have to go." "What's wrong?" my grandfather demanded. "What happened?" Before I could answer, a distant howl scream reached us. The 3 adults exchanged glances. "What was that?" Uncle Devin asked. "I don't know," I lied, "but there's something dangerous in these woods. I've seen it. It chased me yesterday and again just now." "Probably just a wolf," Uncle Ray suggested, but he looked uneasy. "It's not a wolf," I insisted. "Please, can we just go?" My grandfather studied my face, seeing the genuine fear there. Without further questions, he nodded. "All right, let's pack up." We worked quickly, loading our gear into the truck and trailer. As darkness began to fall, we secured the 4-wheelers and did a final sweep of the cabin. The entire time, I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see amber eyes watching us. As we drove away, I looked back at the property through the rear window. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a large shadow move at the edge of the clearing, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. We drove through the night, no one speaking much. My uncles and grandfather clearly thought I'd been spooked by a normal predator, a bear or wolf, but they respected my fear enough not to question me further. I never told them the full story. How could I explain what I'd seen? They wouldn't have believed me. But I know what chased me in those woods wasn't any natural animal. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist in our world but does. Hiding in the remote wilderness, rarely seen but always hunting. In the weeks following our abrupt departure from the hunting trip, I struggled with nightmares and insomnia. Every night, I relived the chase, the creature's unnatural movements, those intelligent amber eyes boring into me. I woke drenched in sweat, convinced it was standing at the foot of my bed, waiting. My parents noticed the change in me but attributed it to typical teenage moodiness. How could I explain that I'd encountered something impossible, something that defied rational explanation? That I'd shot it in the eye, stabbed its brain, and yet it had returned, seemingly unkillable? School became a welcome distraction. During classes, I could almost forget what had happened. But in quiet moments, my mind would drift back to those woods, to the bent sign with claw marks, to the massive tracks, to the creature rising up on two legs with that sickening popping sound. 2 months after the incident, my curiosity overcame my fear. I began researching, spending hours at the library and online, looking for any reports of similar encounters. What I found disturbed me profoundly. There were accounts, dozens of them, from across the country, describing creatures remarkably similar to what I'd seen. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications of bears or wolves, but the consistencies in the descriptions were striking. The enormous size, the wolf-like features, the ability to run on all fours or stand upright, the intelligence in their eyes, even the distinctive smell, all matched my experience. Some accounts came from hunters, park rangers, and wilderness guides, people familiar with normal wildlife behavior who would be unlikely to misidentify a bear or wolf. These stories weren't widely publicized. They existed on obscure forums and in local newspaper archives, often ridiculed or ignored by mainstream sources. I found reports from the very area where we'd stayed dating back decades. In 1978, a forestry worker described being stalked by a massive wolf-like creature that walked like a man. In 1992, a family camping near two harbors abandoned their site after finding tracks the size of dinner plates around their tent and hearing screams like nothing on this earth. In 2007, a hunter vanished in those same woods. When search parties found his camp, they discovered his rifle bent nearly in half. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that what I'd encountered was real and known to others. I began corresponding anonymously with researchers who studied unusual predator behavior, sharing my experience without revealing my age or name. One researcher, a wildlife biologist from northern Minnesota, took particular interest in my account. She had been collecting similar stories for years and believed they represented an undocumented predator species, perhaps a remnant population of a prehistoric wolf ancestor or an extreme case of genetic mutation. The scientific community dismisses these accounts, she wrote to me, but science has been wrong before. New species are discovered every year, even large mammals occasionally. What you encountered may simply be something not yet formally documented. Her rational, scientific approach provided some comfort. If what I'd seen was a flesh and blood animal, albeit an extremely dangerous and unusual one, then it wasn't supernatural. It could be understood, studied, and potentially avoided. But deep down, I remained unconvinced. The creature's intelligence, its ability to survive what should have been fatal wounds, the way it seemed to target me specifically, these aspects suggested something beyond a simple undiscovered predator. Nearly a year passed. The nightmares gradually became less frequent. though they never disappeared entirely. I threw myself into normal teenage activities: school, sports, friends, trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy. My family never returned to the property near Two Harbors. My grandfather sold it without explanation several months after our trip. Then, in the autumn of 2021, everything changed again. I was staying at my friend's cabin about 30 miles from the original location. His family owned a small lakeside property, and several of us were spending the weekend there fishing and hiking. On our second night, as we sat around a campfire roasting marshmallows, the familiar silence descended on the forest, that unnatural quiet that had preceded my first encounter. My body tensed immediately, adrenaline flooding my system. "We need to go inside," I said abruptly, standing up. "What? Why?" my friend asked, confused by my sudden change in demeanor. "Just trust me," I insisted. "Something's wrong." Before anyone could respond, the smell hit us. That same putrid, ammonia-laced stench that had haunted my memories for a year. My friends recoiled, covering their noses. "What is that?" one gagged. "Inside. Now," I ordered, no longer caring if I seemed crazy. I knew what was coming. We hurried into the cabin, locking the door behind us. Through the window, I scanned the tree line, expecting to see amber eyes reflecting the firelight. The others peppered me with questions, but I barely heard them, focused entirely on the darkness beyond the glass. Then I saw it, a massive shadow moving between the trees at the edge of the property. It was just a glimpse, but unmistakable. The same creature, or one like it, had found me again. "Call the ranger station," I told my friend's father. "Tell them there's a dangerous predator outside the cabin." He looked skeptical, but reached for his phone. "No signal," he announced after trying several times. We were on our own. Throughout the night, we took turns keeping watch. I tried explaining what I'd seen the previous year, but my account was met with disbelief, until shortly after midnight, when a massive form rushed past one of the windows, so quickly that only two of us saw it. "That was not a bear," my friend's father said, his face pale in the lamplight. By morning, whatever had stalked us was gone. We packed hurriedly and left, the weekend trip cut short. As we drove away, I stared back at the cabin, wondering if the creature had tracked me specifically or if its territory simply extended this far. The second encounter removed all doubt from my mind. This wasn't coincidence or imagination. Something was out there, and somehow it was connected to me. I needed answers. Over the next several months, I dedicated myself to understanding what I'd encountered. I pored over biological texts, studied predator behavior, and even took wilderness tracking courses, hoping to gain insights that might explain my experiences. I returned to the general area near Two Harbors several times, always with groups, always armed, never staying overnight. During these expeditions, I looked for signs, tracks, claw marks, unusual animal behavior, anything that might confirm the creature's existence. On my third visit, I found something. In a remote section of forest about 5 miles from our original hunting cabin, I discovered a clearing where the vegetation had been flattened in a circular pattern, as if something large had repeatedly bedded down there. The surrounding trees bore claw marks at varying heights, some as high as 9 feet from the ground. Most disturbing were the bones. Scattered throughout the clearing and surrounding area were the remains of deer, moose, and smaller animals. Many showed signs of having been cracked open, presumably to access the marrow. This wasn't unusual in itself. Predators often consume bone marrow. But the sheer strength required to break moose femurs so thoroughly suggested something far more powerful than the typical wolf or bear. I photographed everything and collected several samples: fur caught on tree bark, scat, and one particularly well-preserved track cast in dried mud. I sent these to the wildlife biologist I'd been corresponding with, hoping for scientific validation. Her response came 2 weeks later. The fur was canine in origin, but showed genetic markers that didn't match any known wolf species in North America. The scat analysis revealed a diet consisting primarily of large mammals, with traces of human refuse, suggesting the creature occasionally scavenged from garbage or campsites. The track, she wrote, was consistent with a canid, but scaled to impossible proportions. Whatever left these traces, she concluded, represents either an undocumented species or an extreme anomaly within known canid populations. Either possibility warrants further investigation. She proposed a formal research expedition to the area, equipped with camera traps and other monitoring equipment. I agreed to guide her despite my fear, driven by the need to understand what had pursued me through those woods. In late summer 2022, we returned to the Two Harbors region. Our team was small, just myself, the biologist, Dr. Winters, and her graduate assistant. We carried scientific equipment, camping gear, and, at my insistence, firearms. Dr. Winters was skeptical about the need for weapons, but didn't object, recognizing my experience with the creature. We established our base camp near the clearing I'd discovered, setting up camera traps in a 2-mile radius. For 3 days, we documented the area, collected samples, and monitored wildlife movements. Normal animal activity was noticeably absent. Few birds nested in the trees, no small mammals scurried through the underbrush, and even insects were scarce. This is unusual, Dr. Winters admitted on our third evening. Predator presence typically doesn't eliminate all other wildlife to this extent. Something is keeping them away. That night, our cameras captured the first evidence. The images showed a large, dark form moving through the forest at 2:17 a.m. Though blurry, the shape was consistent with my description, massive, wolf-like, but with proportions that defied biological norms. Dr. Winters was ecstatic. This could be groundbreaking, she said, studying the images. If we can document this creature properly, it would represent one of the most significant zoological discoveries in decades. Her excitement was short-lived. That evening, as darkness fell, the forest went silent. The familiar stench rolled through our camp like a toxic cloud. Dr. Winters and her assistant noticed immediately, their scientific curiosity quickly giving way to unease. "That smell," Dr. Winters whispered. "It's not consistent with any known predator's territorial marking." "It's here," I said simply, retrieving my rifle from the tent. "Both of you, get inside now." But it was too late. From the darkness beyond our campfire came that distinctive howl scream, the sound that had haunted my nightmares for 2 years. Dr. Winters froze, her expression shifting from academic interest to primal fear as she realized we were in imminent danger. The trees at the edge of our clearing began to shake. Something massive was moving toward us, branches snapping under its weight. Then it emerged. The creature, even larger than I remembered. Its right eye was still missing, the socket a mass of scar tissue, confirming this was the same individual I'd shot years before. Dr. Winters gasped, her scientific skepticism evaporating as she faced the impossible reality before us. "My God," she whispered. It can't be." The creature stood upright, reaching its full height of nearly 8 feet, muscles rippling beneath its dark fur. Its remaining amber eye fixed on me with unmistakable recognition. This wasn't a random encounter. It had been searching for me. I raised my rifle and fired, the shot echoing through the silent forest. The bullet struck the creature's chest, causing it to stagger but not fall. Dr. Winters and her assistant retreated to the relative safety of our vehicle while I continued firing, each shot finding its mark but seeming to cause only minimal damage. The creature charged. I dove aside, narrowly avoiding its massive claws. It crashed into our camp, destroying equipment and scattering our supplies. As it turned for another attack, I noticed something. A metal tag embedded in its ear, barely visible beneath the fur. This wasn't just some undocumented species. Someone had tagged it, studied it. Before I could process this revelation, the creature lunged again. I fired my remaining rounds into its face and throat, finally driving it back into the forest. Its retreat wasn't from fear, but seemed almost tactical, as if it were reconsidering its approach. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We abandoned most of our equipment and fled, driving through the night until we reached civilization. The few photographs we managed to save were inconclusive, blurry images that could be dismissed as a bear or other known predator. Our physical samples were lost in the attack, along with most of our documentation. Dr. Winters was shaken, but remained committed to scientific explanation. What we encountered defies conventional classification, she admitted, but it must have a biological origin. The ear tag suggests human involvement, perhaps experimental breeding or genetic modification gone wrong. Her rational approach couldn't account for everything. The creature's apparent immunity to injuries that would kill any known animal, its seeming vendetta against me specifically, the intelligence in its eye that went beyond animal instinct. I've never returned to those woods, though I know the creature is still there, waiting. Sometimes I catch myself scanning distant tree lines, expecting to see a massive shadow watching me. On quiet nights when the wind dies down, I imagine I can detect that distinctive smell carried on the breeze. I don't know what hunted me in those Minnesota forests. Was it some undiscovered predator species? A genetic experiment escaped from a secret facility? Something else entirely? The ear tag suggests human involvement, but raises more questions than it answers. What I know with certainty is this: our understanding of the natural world is incomplete. There are things in the remote wilderness that defy explanation, that shouldn't exist but do. And if you ever find yourself in the northern woods and notice an unnatural silence falling around you, followed by the stench of decay and ammonia, run. Don't look back. Don't try to understand. Just run. My name is Zachary, and this is my true account of what happened 5 years ago in the forests near Two Harbors, Minnesota. I share it not to frighten, but to warn. Something is out there, watching and waiting. And it remembers those who've encountered it before. I've spent the last 34 years trying to understand what happened to me in that small Romanian mountain village. The memory remains crystal clear, as if it occurred yesterday rather than in the distant summer of 1984. Each night when I close my eyes, I find myself transported back to that moment when reality seemed to fold in on itself, when I experienced something that defies rational explanation. Growing up in Eastern Europe during the final decade of communist rule meant many hardships for families. Resources were scarce, medical care was basic, and my childhood was defined by persistent illness. At 4 years old, I had already become intimately familiar with the sound of my own labored breathing, the burning sensation of fever, and the constant fatigue that accompanied my weak constitution. My medical records were thick with documented respiratory infections, bronchitis, and mysterious ailments that left doctors scratching their heads. My parents worked tirelessly in a factory on the outskirts of Bucharest, leaving little time for managing a chronically ill child. It was decided that my grandparents would take me to the Carpathian Mountains for the summer. The clean mountain air was reputed to have healing properties for children with respiratory problems. In those days, allergies weren't commonly diagnosed. Weakness of constitution was attributed to poor living conditions or simply bad luck. My grandfather, a retired military man with a stern face but gentle hands, believed the mountains would put some strength into my bones. My grandmother, with her medical background as a retired nurse, packed numerous home remedies and insisted this trip would transform me. I remember the ride on the crowded train, pressed against the window as the landscape transformed from flat plains to rolling hills, and finally to the majestic peaks of the northern Carpathians. What we didn't know then, what we couldn't have known, was that this trip would indeed transform me, but not in the way any of us anticipated. The mountains held something for me that would forever alter my perception of reality. The resort town of Vatra Dornay nestled in the mountains like a precious stone set within nature's crown. In May of 1984, before the major tourist season began, it was quiet and serene. The air carried the scent of pine and wild mountain herbs, crisp and invigorating compared to the polluted atmosphere of Bucharest. Our hotel stood in the center of a sprawling park that seamlessly blended into the surrounding forest. The building itself was a remnant of the Austro-Hungarian era, ornate yet somewhat dilapidated after decades of communist neglect. The rooms were basic but clean, with heavy woolen blankets and windows that opened to spectacular mountain views. I remember being captivated by the squirrels that populated the park. These were no ordinary creatures. Generations of human interaction had made them bold. They would approach tourists without hesitation, climbing up legs and taking food directly from outstretched hands. My grandfather purchased walnuts from the hotel shop, showing me how to crack them open slightly before offering them. The squirrels would race down tree trunks at the familiar sound, their tiny claws scratching against bark. The village proper lay below our hotel, stretched along the main road that followed ancient trading routes through the mountains. The town center consisted of a few administrative buildings, several tiny shops with limited merchandise, a restaurant that served traditional Romanian dishes, and a bakery where the scent of fresh kozanac and other pastries wafted through the air each morning. At the heart of this modest settlement stood the train station, a small wooden structure that nonetheless represented connection to the outside world. Twice daily, trains would arrive, disgorging tourists or carrying away locals on errands to larger towns. The main road split near the edge of town, forming a Y shape over a narrow concrete bridge that spanned a mountain creek. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones worn by centuries of persistent flow. Along one branch of the road, a single row of houses clung to the hillside, their foundations seemingly defying gravity as they perched between the creek and the steep, wooded slope behind them. My early days in Vatra Dornay were filled with small pleasures. Collecting pine cones, watching ants march in perfect formation, listening to my grandmother's stories about the mountains and the spirits that supposedly dwelled within them. My grandfather would lift me onto his shoulders for walks through the woods, pointing out different bird calls and teaching me how to identify animal tracks. For the first time in my young life, I felt healthy. The mountain air seemed to clear my lungs, and my persistent cough had begun to subside. Little did I know that the sense of well-being was temporary, a cruel prelude to events that would haunt me for decades to come. The incident occurred on our 5th day in Vatra Dornay. The morning had dawned clear and warm, with a slight humidity that suggested the possibility of afternoon thunderstorms. After breakfast in the hotel dining room, my grandparents decided to walk into the village to purchase supplies and souvenirs. We made our way down the winding path from the hotel, through the park, where I stopped briefly to greet my squirrel friends. My grandmother held my hand firmly as we navigated the uneven sidewalks of the main street. The village was quiet that day, a Tuesday, I believe, with only a few locals going about their business and the occasional tourist examining the modest offerings in shop windows. Near the end of the main street stood a small boutique that sold handcrafted items, carved wooden figurines, embroidered blouses, and other traditional Romanian handicrafts. My grandmother wanted to purchase gifts for my parents and our relatives back home. As we approached the shop, something about it triggered an inexplicable dread within me. The window display featured wooden masks with exaggerated features, wide eyes, gaping mouths, prominent cheekbones. Traditional art, certainly, but to my 4-year-old perception, they seemed to be watching me, judging me, warning me away. "I don't want to go in," I said, tugging at my grandmother's hand. "Don't be silly," she replied. "It will only take a few minutes." But as we reached the doorway, my resistance grew stronger. A powerful instinct warned me against entering that space. Without fully understanding why, I knew with absolute certainty that I should not cross that threshold. "I'm a dog," I announced suddenly, dropping to all fours on the sidewalk. Dogs aren't allowed in shops. My grandparents exchanged exasperated glances. They had grown accustomed to my imaginative play, but had little patience for it when it interfered with their plans. "Stand up," my grandfather said firmly. "This isn't the time for games." But I refused. When they attempted to physically guide me into the shop, I broke free and wrapped my arms around a nearby light pole, clinging to it with all the strength my small body could muster. "Dogs stay outside," I insisted, burying my face against the metal pole. After several failed attempts to dislodge me, my grandmother finally threw up her hands in frustration. "Fine. Dogs stay where you leave them. Don't move from this spot, do you understand? We'll be right back." I nodded enthusiastically, relieved they had conceded. To demonstrate my commitment to the role, I made barking sounds and pantomimed scratching my ear with my foot. My grandfather looked concerned about leaving me, but my grandmother assured him I would be fine for the few minutes they would be inside. "Do not move from this pole," my grandfather warned, his voice serious. "Not one step." I watched them enter the shop, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. Through the window, I could see them speaking with the shopkeeper, occasionally glancing outside to check on me. I continued my dog impersonation, even pretending to sniff the base of the pole. And then, something changed. The quality of the light shifted almost imperceptibly. The sounds of the village, distant conversations, a radio playing somewhere, the gentle bubble of the creek, seemed to fade like a radio being slowly turned down. My consciousness experienced something akin to a camera lens adjusting focus. One moment I was pretending to be a dog outside the shop, and the next, I was somewhere else entirely. The disorientation was instant and absolute. I found myself standing on the same road, but everything had fundamentally changed. I was no longer in front of the boutique, but several hundred meters away, near where the road curved around toward the creek bridge. My first coherent thought was that I had broken my promise to my grandparents. Somehow, without any memory of moving, I had wandered far from where they had left me. Fear of their disappointment was quickly overshadowed, however, by the dawning realization that something was profoundly wrong with my surroundings. The silence was the first thing I noticed. A complete absence of sound so profound it seemed to have physical weight. No birds called from the trees. The creek, which should have been audibly rushing over stones, made no sound whatsoever. Even my own footsteps, as I tentatively moved forward, produced no noise. I tried to speak, to call out, but while I could feel my vocal cords vibrating, no sound reached my ears. The silence wasn't merely the absence of noise. It was as if the concept of sound itself had been erased from the universe. The light, too, was wrong. Despite being midday, the village was bathed in a murky twilight. The colors appeared drained, as if I were viewing everything through a filter that stripped away vibrancy, leaving behind only muted approximations of the world I knew. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of life. No people walked the streets. No animals moved in the woods. No insects buzzed in the air. The village appeared identical in layout to the one I had been in moments before, yet entirely devoid of any living presence save my own. I took several steps forward, my mind operating with a strange clarity that felt disconnected from my 4-year-old self. Rather than panic, I observed my situation with an analytical detachment that seems impossible in retrospect. It was then that I noticed the shadows. Looking down at my feet, I saw not one shadow, but 6, radiating outward from where I stood like the spokes of a wheel. Each shadow pointed in a different direction, yet there was no obvious light source to create them. Instinctively, I looked upward. The sky above contained neither sun nor moon nor clouds. It wasn't blue or black or any color I could name. The closest description I can offer is that it resembled a vast ceiling of swirling, textured gray, like static on a television screen frozen in a single moment, simultaneously distant and oppressively close. As I stood in that silent place, I became aware of a peculiar sensation, the feeling of being observed, not by eyes I could see, but by some consciousness that permeated the very air around me. The empty houses no longer seemed merely vacant. They felt expectant, as if something within them was waiting, watching, assessing. I continued walking, drawn forward by a compulsion I couldn't articulate. Each house I passed seemed to turn its attention toward me, following my progress like a crowd tracking a performer across a stage. The windows, all empty, all dark, nonetheless gave the impression of countless eyes. Time behaved strangely in this place. Though it seemed I wandered for hours, exploring the silent village with its watchful buildings, the quality of the non-light never changed. There was no progression from day to night, no subtle shift in temperature or atmosphere. It existed in a perpetual now, unchanged and unchanging. Eventually, I found myself back at the light pole where I had last seen my grandparents. The boutique stood before me, its windows now black voids rather than displays of crafts. Something told me this was where I needed to be, that this location represented a doorway between worlds. I reached out to touch the pole, and as my fingers contacted the cold metal, "Where have you been? My God, where have you been?" My grandfather's voice was ragged with emotion as he grabbed my shoulders, his weathered face inches from mine. His eyes were red-rimmed, his cheeks wet with tears. Behind him stood my grandmother, her hand pressed to her mouth, her entire body trembling. Disoriented by the sudden return of sound, color, and life, I blinked up at him in confusion. "I was right here," I said. "I was being a good dog. I waited for you." My grandfather scooped me into his arms, holding me against his chest with a desperate strength that bordered on painful. Over his shoulder, I could see a crowd gathering, the shopkeeper, other tourists, several locals I recognized from the hotel. "He's found her!" someone called out, and a collective sigh of relief rippled through the assembled people. "I don't understand," I said, my voice small against the cacophony of excited voices. "I didn't go anywhere." My grandmother approached, her hands fluttering over me as if to assure herself I was real. 5 hours, she whispered. "You've been missing for 5 hours." This made no sense to me. From my perspective, virtually no time had passed. I had been in that strange, silent world for what felt like perhaps an hour at most. And then I was back. The crowd pressed closer, everyone talking at once. I heard fragments of conversations. Someone mentioned calling off the search parties. Another suggested notifying the police that I had been found. A woman with a kind face offered my grandmother a handkerchief for her tears. "Where did you find her?" asked a man in the uniform of the hotel staff. "Right here," my grandfather said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Right where we left her, at this exact spot." "Impossible," someone muttered. "We checked here dozens of times." I buried my face against my grandfather's shoulder, overwhelmed by the attention and increasingly confused by the disconnect between my experience and theirs. The strange clarity of mind I had possessed in the silent world was fading, replaced by the limited understanding of my 4-year-old self. "I was a dog," I insisted. "I was waiting right here." Later, in our hotel room, my grandparents tried again to understand what had happened. They described how they had been in the shop for less than 5 minutes when they came out to find me gone. At first, they thought I might be hiding as part of my dog game, but after calling my name and searching the immediate area, their concern grew to panic. They enlisted the help of shopkeepers, hotel staff, and other tourists. Search parties formed, combing the village and surrounding woods. The creek was checked repeatedly, fear of drowning foremost in everyone's minds. Even the train was searched when it arrived at the station, in case I had wandered aboard. For 5 hours, the search continued without success. No one had seen a small child walking alone. No one had heard calls for help. I had simply vanished, as completely as if I had never existed. And then, just as mysteriously, I reappeared, standing at the exact spot where I had last been seen, appearing confused but unharmed, insisting I had never left. That night, as I lay in bed watching shadows dance across the ceiling from passing car headlights, I tried to tell my grandparents about the silent place, about the multiple shadows and the watching houses. They exchanged worried glances, attributing my story to an overactive imagination, or perhaps a defensive reaction to whatever traumatic experience they believed I must have had. "Try to sleep now," my grandmother said, smoothing my hair. "Everything is fine. You're safe." But as I drifted toward sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that part of me remained in that silent world, that I had left something behind, or worse, brought something back with me. The illness struck without warning in the early hours of the morning. I woke drenched in sweat, my small body burning with fever. When I tried to call out for my grandparents, my throat felt as though I had swallowed broken glass. My grandmother, always a light sleeper, heard my weak cries and rushed to my bedside. Her cool hand against my forehead confirmed what she already suspected. "He's burning up," she told my grandfather, who was fumbling for his glasses in the dim light. What followed was a blur of discomfort and confusion. I vaguely remember being wrapped in cool, wet towels to bring down my temperature. My grandfather left to find a doctor, returning with a local physician who examined me with grave concern. "Food poisoning, perhaps," the doctor suggested, though this explanation seemed to satisfy no one, least of all my grandparents, who pointed out that we had all eaten the same meals. The fever brought with it vivid hallucinations that blurred the line between the waking world and nightmares. In these fever dreams, I returned again and again to the silent village. Only now, I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved at the periphery of my vision, never quite visible head-on, but unmistakably present. They seemed to be watching me, following at a distance, communicating with each other in ways I couldn't comprehend. Whenever I turned to confront them, they would slip away, retreating into doorways or around corners, leaving behind only the impression of elongated limbs and oddly angled heads. In one particularly vivid episode, I found myself standing before the boutique again. The wooden masks in the window had come alive, their features contorting in silent screams. They pressed against the glass as if trying to break through to reach me. Behind them, deeper in the shop, stood a tall, thin figure. Though I could make out no details of its appearance, I understood with absolute certainty that it was the source of my fear, the reason I had refused to enter the shop. I would wake from these visions screaming, only to be soothed back to restless sleep by my exhausted grandparents. The fever raged for 3 days, defying the medications prescribed by the doctor. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it broke. I woke on the 4th morning weak but lucid, the nightmares fading like morning mist. My grandparents had already packed our belongings. We would be leaving Vatradorne immediately, cutting our vacation short by 2 weeks. Though neither of them said as much, I understood they were afraid, not just for my health, but of the place itself. The journey home remains a fragmented memory. I recall my grandfather carrying me to the train station, my body too weak to walk the distance. I remember the concerned glances of fellow passengers as my grandmother continually checked my temperature during the long ride. Most clearly, I recall the moment when the mountains receded in the distance, and the profound relief that washed over me as they disappeared from view. We never returned to Vatradorne. In fact, my grandparents never took me on another vacation, despite my eventual return to health. When friends or relatives asked about our truncated trip, my grandparents offered vague explanations about my illness. The true story of my disappearance remained our secret, at least for a time. Strangely, my parents weren't immediately told about the incident. My grandparents waited several months before sharing even a sanitized version of events, omitting the more inexplicable elements. I've often wondered about this decision, Were they afraid of being blamed for negligence? Or did they themselves struggle to accept what had happened, preferring to bury the memory rather than examine it too closely? The years following my experience in Vatra brought significant changes to my life and to Romania itself. The Ceausescu regime fell in the bloody revolution of 1989. Borders opened, allowing greater freedom of movement and information. My family, like many others, struggled through the economic hardships of transition, but eventually found stability in the new system. Through it all, the memory of those silent hours remained with me, influencing my development in ways both subtle and profound. As a child, I developed an intense fear of being alone. I struggled with separation anxiety that baffled my parents and frustrated my teachers. I insisted on keeping lights on at night and developed elaborate bedtime rituals designed to ward off the darkness and what might lurk within it. My academic interests eventually led me to study psychology, driven perhaps by a subconscious desire to understand my own experience. I became particularly fascinated by temporal lobe epilepsy and other neurological conditions that can produce altered states of consciousness. Could my experience be explained by some brief neurological event? A seizure that distorted my perception of time and reality? This rational explanation provided some comfort, but it failed to account for the 5 hours during which I was objectively missing. No seizure lasts that long without causing permanent damage, yet I had emerged physically unharmed, except for the subsequent illness. In my late 20s, I returned to Romania for the first time since childhood, drawn by both professional opportunities and personal ghosts. I didn't visit Vatra, I couldn't bring myself to go that far. But I spent time in Bucharest, reconnecting with extended family and researching local folklore. It was during this period that I discovered stories with unsettling similarities to my experience. In the mountain regions especially, there were tales of people who temporarily vanished, only to reappear with no memory of where they had been. These disappearances were often attributed to spirits or supernatural beings, explanations I had always dismissed as superstition. More intriguing were the accounts of thin places, locations where the boundary between our world and others supposedly becomes permeable under certain conditions. In Romanian folklore, these places were often identified by unusual natural features or were associated with historical tragedies. When I mentioned these findings to my aging grandfather during a phone call, his response was unexpected. Rather than dismissing the folklore as nonsense, he fell silent for a long moment. "There are things in this world we don't understand," he finally said, his voice heavy with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Things science cannot explain." This from a man who had always prided himself on his rationality, who had mocked my grandmother's occasional references to folk remedies and old superstitions. His words sent a chill through me, suggesting that perhaps he had seen or sensed something that day that he had never shared. 3 years ago, during what would be our final visit before his death, I gathered the courage to ask my grandfather directly about that day in Vatra. Age had softened his once intimidating demeanor, and serious health problems had made him more reflective, more willing to discuss matters he had previously avoided. We sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the sunset paint the Bucharest skyline in shades of orange and purple. I recorded our conversation, wanting to preserve his account of that day. "I've never told you this," he began, his voice thinner than I remembered, but still carrying the authority that had defined him throughout my childhood. "When we realized you were missing, your grandmother wanted to call the police immediately, but I convinced her to wait, to search ourselves first." He paused, staring out at the city below us. "I was afraid, you see. Not just for your safety, but of what the authorities might do. Those were different times. Children didn't just disappear in communist Romania without questions being asked, investigations that could cause problems for the family." I nodded, understanding the complex realities of life under the regime. "We searched everywhere," he continued. "Every shop, every house along the main street, The hotel staff checked each room, the kitchen, the basement. Some men even went into the woods with flashlights, calling your name. He described how my grandmother had walked the entire length of the creek, terrified she would find my body in the water. How they had stopped the afternoon train and searched every compartment. How as time passed, hope had given way to a dreadful certainty that something terrible had happened. And then, he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, I felt something. A pull, like a hand guiding me back to where we had left you. Others had checked that spot repeatedly. We all had. But something told me to look again. He described returning to the light pole, expecting to find nothing, as had been the case during previous searches. Instead, there I stood, exactly where they had left me, looking slightly confused, but otherwise unharmed. It was impossible, he said. Impossible. That spot had been checked dozens of times. People had been walking past it continuously during the search. You couldn't have approached it without being seen. You simply appeared. The scientific part of my mind immediately began generating explanations. Perhaps I had been hiding somewhere nearby, too frightened to come out until I saw my grandfather. Perhaps in the chaos of the search, people had simply missed seeing me, a small child easily overlooked. But these explanations rang hollow, especially in light of my own memories of that silent watching place. What do you think happened? I asked. My grandfather was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of certainty. I think you went somewhere else, he said simply. Somewhere not of this world. And somehow, you found your way back. He told me how in the days following my return, while I was sick with fever, my grandmother had spoken with an elderly woman in the village. This woman had mentioned other incidents, not common, but not unique either, of people, especially children, who had briefly vanished in the area, always returning with similar stories of silence and strangeness. Your grandmother wanted to leave immediately, but we had to wait until you were well enough to travel, he explained. Those were the longest days of my life. I was afraid you might disappear again, and this time not return. As our conversation drew to a close, my grandfather took my hand in his skin paper-thin over prominent veins. I've asked myself many times over the years what happened to you that day, he said. Whether there was something I could have done differently, whether I failed to protect you from whatever it was. I assured him that there was nothing he could have done, that even now, with all the research I had conducted, I had no definitive explanation for what had occurred. Some mysteries remain unsolved, he said, patting my hand. Perhaps that's as it should be. My grandfather passed away 6 months later. At his funeral, standing beside his grave in the heavy summer heat, I found myself thinking not of his final years, but of that day in Vatra Dornay, of the fear in his eyes when he found me, and of the questions that had haunted him for decades. Today, 34 years after my unexplained disappearance, I continue to search for answers. I've documented similar cases throughout Eastern Europe and beyond. I've consulted with neurologists, physicists, and even parapsychologists. I've returned to analyzing the folklore of the region, looking for patterns in the stories of those who vanished and returned. Sometimes, in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I find myself back in that silent village with its watching houses and impossible shadows. I feel again the sensation of being observed by something just beyond the reach of comprehension. And I wonder if perhaps the boundary between worlds is thinner than we imagine, if reality itself is more permeable, more fluid than our science can currently explain. What happened to me in Vatra Dornay? My rational mind continues to search for neurological or psychological explanations. But another part of me, the part that experienced the absolute silence and the watching presence, knows that some experiences lie beyond conventional understanding. The child I was glimpsed something behind the curtain of reality. The adult I've become has spent a lifetime trying to comprehend what I saw there, and why, Unlike others who have reportedly vanished into such places, I was permitted to return.